Thank you for coming to our afternoon session. Are economic pressures on university press acquisitions quietly changing the shape of the scholarly record? I'm Emily Farrell from De Gruyter, and I'm going to start out this session by first giving some background and some research context for the topic of today's session. I'm going to then hand it over to Kaiser Walker from Cornell University Library, who will be presenting some of the survey results from our acquisitions editor survey, along with Mahinda Kingra, who is the editorial director of Cornell University Press. Then Nicole Kenjeski from Project Muse will talk a bit about the more quantitative side that we looked at, some revenue data from and title output data from university presses. And then we're going to draw it together, talk about some of our preliminary findings and some of the many questions that have come out of this initial investigation, as well as presenting some next steps. And then finally, of course, you will ask all sorts of exciting and enthralling questions to help further our research. So the scholarly monograph, what is it and does it still matter? Broadly speaking, a scholarly monograph is a work of scholarship on a particular topic or theme which is written by a scholar or scholars and intended for use primarily by other scholars. It's necessarily long in form to be comprehensive, and it's also necessarily narrowly focused. The scholarly monograph remains important because it is still the central point for tenure and promotion in the humanities and qualitative social sciences. It still, despite changes, remains the form through which to present comprehensive scholarly research in the best way. And it's also an enduring and stable format. So it's one that we've had with us for a while, and certainly for long-term preservation and for libraries, the stability of the format is important. So why then university presses in particular? As Amy Brand from MIT Press recently wrote, with higher education, science and the notion of truth itself under attack in many parts of the world today, the university press commitment to the integrity of knowledge creation and sharing enterprise has renewed urgency and relevance. American university presses have historically been the home of the scholarly monograph in the US, particularly where commercial presses have moved away from monograph publishing to focus on more financially lucrative products like STEM journals. As one of our survey respondents noted, who had worked in university publishing, in fact, for 26 years, said, "Our jobs are to help scholars advance their fields of research and inquiry, not to make money. If we can gain efficiencies that let us break even, that's a bonus. But at this press, the mission comes first." So there's certainly an importance there in terms of a focus on mission and narrow scholarly research. So you might wonder why then someone from De Gruyter is standing up here, a commercial press, speaking about university press publishing, and likewise Project Muse involved in this sort of topic. And both Muse and De Gruyter have worked closely with university presses, particularly in the arena of digital distribution. For De Gruyter in particular, there's quite a natural fit as a publisher who has continued to focus on very narrowly focused research and published books that otherwise were rejected by other publishers. Chomsky's syntactic structures a nice example. So our monographs sit quite happily alongside university press scholarly monographs, and including partners like Cornell University Press, who we've worked together with to digitize archive content and to provide solutions to frontlist ebook access. There's also a long history in university press publishing of collaboration and cooperation, not only between university presses and their host institutions, but also external funding bodies, commercial presses and aggregators. There's also a lot of talk at the moment about what sort of crisis we're in when it comes to humanities monograph publishing. There's certainly been a long discussion about this, whether we're in a crisis and the financial struggle of publishing narrow research. But certainly I think we can say that the ecosystem has changed. The differences that we're dealing with come as a consequence of the digital era, things like the push to open access and whether there are stable models for continuing to publish research open access, the increase in libraries for just-in-time collecting because books are now seen as never going out of print with ebooks, diminishing library budgets with a slow recovery after the financial crisis in 2008, the fact that STEM journals continue to take a larger share of library budgets, and that there's the question of how to collect or whether it's possible to collect in dual format. For presses particularly, there is a decrease in sales per title, but at the same time, recent research has shown that the cost for publication remains very high, certainly on the top end. So the Marin report from 2016 says that there's a range between 15,000 to 129,000 when you take into account in-kind contributions, for instance, from universities. So why is it that we're focusing on university? Why are we focusing on acquisitions editors in particular? When we've looked at what research is out there, there's a lot of great work on the scholarly monograph and university presses, but there hasn't been much of a connection made at the point where books are actually being acquired at presses. And we wanted to find some answers to questions about what's happening there, particularly as in other research reports, the importance and centrality of acquisitions has been highlighted. For instance, that the character and reputation of a press is very much linked to the acquisitions side, and that, but at the same time, the costs for the staff time costs for editors is one of the highest costs that presses manage. Right, turning it over to Kaiser.
As an advocate for sustainable scholarship who stands mostly outside of the publishing world, my principal interest in the study was to better understand the impact of what Modern Languages Association Task Force, as early as 2006, was already describing as a narrowing of publishing possibilities, especially in fields viewed as marginal, due to economic pressures on the university presses. As a librarian, I'm particularly interested in the dynamic between our collection development decision-making, where we're investing our funds, and the viability of the publishers that are situated in our own institutions. The quote that's up on the screen is from the 2014 AAU-ARL prospectus for an institutionally funded first book subvention. This is the basis of the TOME initiative that I'm sure many of you know about. Not clear yet to what extent this open access monograph initiative or others like it might succeed in shifting the dynamic that's described here, that in today's environment, the market model for the monograph, one that depends on commercial viability via book sales, may underserve smaller and highly specialized fields, or even block access to book publishing for scholars in these fields. Meanwhile, though, we wanted to understand just how real this dynamic actually is that has been a source of concern. So these are the basic questions guiding our study. How are economic pressures on the UPs affecting monograph publication? And more specifically, are guidelines, incentives, priorities, workflows for acquisitions editors changing in the context of falling monograph sales? And I want to emphasize here that our research is really very preliminary, and so are the results, and should be regarded as such. We conducted this preliminary study in two parts. There's a quantitative piece that Nicole's going to be talking about, looking at sales and acquisitions data that we got from 5 publishers. You can say more about that. Then there was a qualitative piece that was based at Cornell that centered on a survey of editorial directors and acquisition editors. The questions pertain to the status of the scholarly monograph and the edited volume. We asked respondents to exclude handbooks, reference works, trade books, etc. from their consideration. Mahinder Kingra mailed the survey announcement directly to more than 400 individual email addresses, I think, of UP editors, as well as to an acquisitions listserv sponsored by the Association of University Presses, the AUP-ACQ list that maybe some of you are on. And that survey was also distributed internally to one commercial publisher of scholarly monographs. We received 101 responses. The survey was anonymous. We didn't seek to limit the number of editors responding from any single press, nor did the survey include a way to group responses by press. We asked respondents to identify their role, whether they were acquiring editors, editorial directors, or editors-in-chief, or as editorial directors who also serve a direct acquisitions role. 23 respondents identified themselves as editorial directors or editors-in-chief. 15 specified only that role, and 8 said they also acquired books in a particular subject area. We take this as an indication that we heard from at least 23 individual presses, likely more, since we may have received responses from acquiring editors at a press without the editorial director having responded. Oh.
Move it closer. Just pull it closer.
Just pull it closer.
Yeah. Big's on.
Okay, I'm sorry about that.
Probably could bring it closer and pull it down a little bit.
So all the respondents could answer. Is that better?
Not better.
No?
Put it right up there.
Right in here, okay. How's that? Is it on?
It's on.
Okay. Okay, so again, we heard from 23. We feel confident that we heard from at least 23 individual presses, but probably more because some of the responses would have come probably from acquiring editors who, without their director having responded. So we don't know really how many presses responded to the survey because of the anonymity, okay? All respondents could answer every question, but depending on the type of information gathered, some of the figures we're going to be showing are based on all the responses, and some of them are based on just the responses from the editorial directors. So whenever they were answering for the press as a whole, we tried to look at just those 23 responses, which of course is a limited number, but hopefully somewhat representative. So this slide had been sitting up here for a while. We made a point of keeping, as I said, the responses anonymous. And one of the ways we have of grouping them together, since we aren't able to group them together by press, was by the revenue tiers, the AUP, Association of University Press revenue tiers, these groupings. You can see what that means in terms of annual revenue and press size on the slide. We got 24 responses from Group 4 presses, the ones with the highest revenue, the biggest presses, 23 from Group 3 presses, 22 from Group 2 presses, and 23 from Group 1 presses. And then there were 9 responses that didn't identify an AUP grouping at all. So it was pretty evenly distributed among the press sizes. And a lot of the findings we'll show are broken down by the AUP group. Okay. So we asked editors to indicate the subject areas in which they acquire. We provided a list of 16 subjects, and they're the same ones that were used in the quantitative piece of the study. It's a limited set, and a lot of people, one of the responses we got back was, well, why not have included the area in which I select? We included an other category, and we got a lot of responses. That you see the biggest single category was other, and we received text responses that indicated what those areas are, but we won't be talking about that in detail here. Mahinder's going to be providing highlights from the responses that pertain specifically to acquisitions decision-making. I want to quickly share just a few slides that show changes in the ways that presses say they're producing and distributing monographs. We asked, thank you. We asked for estimates of presses' annual print runs for monographs and how this has changed over time. We asked what it looked like 10 years ago, 5 years ago, and today. As publishers and librarians in the audience are no doubt aware, print monograph sales have dropped sharply and steadily over the past several years. At least in part, shrinking print runs reflect falling sales expectations, although the two things are also somewhat separate. Interesting that the drop in print run clearly shows up in the survey responses as more dramatic the smaller the press. So the smallest presses had the biggest drop in print runs over that 10-year period, and the larger ones a smaller drop. Group 4 presses showed a 35% drop from 10 years ago, and Group 1 presses a 62% drop, according to their self-reporting. So in this context, we were kind of surprised by the data that's showing up in this slide, that here they were asked to estimate the percentage of frontlist monographs that are currently produced as print on demand at their press. And here it's the 23 editors-in-chief who are answering. So the percentages, are dealing with fairly small numbers. So I realize that does sort of skew things a bit, but still it's kind of dramatic. The difference between the largest presses and the rest, and also the fact that it's showing a relatively low utilization of print on demand for frontlist titles. And given the erratic and shrinking sales figures that people also talked about, we were surprised to see that there wasn't more use of a POD, I think. Next. So also striking was the small share of monograph sales revenue that editors from presses of all sizes told us that ebooks represent for them. These estimates include ebook sales for every type of platform, publishers' own platforms if they have them, aggregator platforms that libraries license, of course, and then Kindle and other ebook, EPUB editions that are sold to individual readers. So it's low. This is really everything, and these are the kind of low numbers that are still being reported. I don't know, that surprised me. Maybe it didn't surprise the colleagues from the press side. And then finally, we asked editors if their presses are actively acquiring monographs as part of an open access program, or if they plan to begin doing so in the next 2 years. Of the 23 responses from editorial directors, 11 said no, they have no OA program for frontlist monographs and no plans to start one in the near term. 7 said they have an OA program today. 4 said they were planning one, and 1 was unsure. And here it's broken down again by the AEP group. I'm going to hand it over to Mahinder.
All right. There we go. So given this new ecosystem and sort of plunging sales and uncertainty about the way that books are being read and delivered and purchased, we then want to find out how this has affected acquisitions editors, the work they do, and how they are assessed. So I'm working on multiple computers here because I'm like a DJ. So of the editors who responded, we want to find out who the editors were, not specifically, but sort of what their qualifications were. 60% of the editors who responded had masters or PhDs in the fields in which they acquire. And on average, they had worked as acquisitions editors for 14 years, with the longest serving editor in the survey reporting that they had worked for 39 years. So this is a fairly experienced group of editors. And so we asked, how has their assessment of their performance on the job changed over the past 10 years? And here, revenue, of course, as you might imagine, given these circumstances, was over the past 10 years had become much more important in terms of how their performance was assessed. Revenue was a factor 10 years on among 47% of the respondents, and quality of the projects or reputation of the projects that they acquired was only 16% of that. Which do I have here? There we go. And to look more at sort of the changes in the way that performance was assessed, if you look at this sort of bar graph here, you can see that the fields are more focused on revenue, more focus on trade books, and more books per editor, or introducing new quantitative measures. And if you combine all of these, the 40% who reported that the metrics for their job had changed, 80% of them have to do with revenue, whether it's either direct assessments of revenue or in terms of increasing revenue through increased number of titles they're being asked to acquire, or the mix of books that would be more saleable books like trade books or textbooks. So clearly revenue is on the mind of editors and of their supervisors. Here we have 2 quotes from 2 of the respondents that basically indicate the way that the new economics of publishing have affected the way that performance is being assessed. One editor reporting that the focus is now more on profit than on mission, and one actually saying that the dollar targets are in fact less important now because we can't actually assess anything. We can't even predict how few we're going to be selling of some monographs. So what is the work of acquisitions editors? Acquisitions editors are gatekeepers. We asked what the rejection rate of proposals were coming across the transom, and across all of the AUP groups responding, 64% of proposals were estimated to be rejected. The highest number of rejections were at the group 4 presses, which was 71%, and the lowest was at the group 2, which was sort of the 1.5 to 3 at 53%. But basically, editors are gatekeepers, and the primary reason for rejecting a proposal was the quality of the proposal itself. Why is this important? This is important because every yes that an editor says to a proposal is conservatively a commitment of $20,000 on the press's part. So basically, every time I say yes, I'm telling Cornell that they're going to be shelling out $20,000 to publish the book that I have just accepted. It makes it fairly easy to turn down projects that have come in at 350,000 words and 150 illustrations in 3 volumes. This just happened to me recently, which I had to say no to. But it's not always that easy. And so editors are using their experience, their knowledge of the fields, sometimes consulting with colleagues, with series editors in order to determine whether proposals should go through or not. So we also wanted to find out, in terms of acquisitions, how editors are thinking about publishing books in this environment. And so subsidies are a key part, title subsidies are a key part of what keeps the economics of monograph publishing going. As you can see here, across the board, it's about 31%, I think, of presses, 31% of the books published by all of the presses come with some sort of subvention, usually from the author's institution or their department. This would include open access funding, like through Tome. It does not include institutional funding for the university presses themselves that come, the annual subventions that come in. This is for title only. So it's about 1/3 of all books require, well, actually more require, but 31% come with subsidies. Given all of the uncertainties, editors must be very trepidatious in entering new fields. And so we wanted to find out then, in a series of questions, how did they decide to enter new fields or start new series? I think this quote here, "It's more the art than science," says a lot. And what the editors were really doing is looking for, as you can see, this is a descending graph, identifying trends in academia. That's the primary work of acquisitions editors. It is going out at conferences, it is talking to colleagues on campus, or faculty on campus visits, talking to colleagues, talking to series editors, reading the scholarly journals to determine what are the new trends in academia. We broke it down here. Passive research, which is conversation with scholars. Active research was actually going out and mining conference data to see which terms are being used more, which subjects are being discussed more. At the very bottom of this is the cost of entering a new field. This is not something editors think about when they're entering a new field, which I think is interesting, as we'll see later. And in the next slide here, again, this was, rather than a new field, a new series, but again, the idea is the same, that editors are really pursuing the most current, the latest, the cutting edge, the most impactful scholarship. So almost 70% would launch a new series in an emerging subject area. Funding, less than 1%, might have been a little, between 1% and 2%, is a factor in determining whether or not to launch a new series. But what happens when things don't work out? Why do editors leave a series or close a series? And here, it's because of poor sales. That was overwhelmingly the reason why editors closed a series. So you can see we enter a series very boldly, not thinking about the costs, and then when sales turn out not to turn out the way we hoped, we then have to close the series. Now, I should say that poor sales also reflect some of these other categories. The subfield is no longer intellectually vibrant. If it's not vibrant, people aren't going to be buying books in it, and there are going to be no sales. So sales is in some way sort of a leading indicator of a whole bunch of other things. But personal interest, I get bored, was one of my favorites. I've had that feeling sometimes in the middle of a manuscript, but that's a whole other thing. And then that is, so I think I'll just close this section by saying I think editors are analyzing a lot of data, not all of it quantitative. Some of it is, and I think that's where some of the future research is going to be leading. So with that, and talking about quantitative data, I turn it over to Nicole. You can sit if you want, I can go through.
That's fine, I can stand. So thank you, I'm Nicole from Project Muse, and to supplement the survey results, we thought we'd look at some data as well to give a little bit more well-rounded picture of what we're seeing. And just a summary, we did look at sales data and title acquisition counts across 16 subjects from 5 publishers of varying sizes. The subjects, as you may have seen from an earlier slide, ranged from very broad areas like history and art to very specific like urban studies and Jewish studies. We then used that data to perform a correlation analysis to determine if there actually was any relationship between that information. And we looked at that data not only at a high level across all publishers, but also at the detailed subject level area. There are some caveats though. Obviously 5 publishers does not equal a lot of data. This is preliminary research just to see if we can find anything interesting and to hopefully inform and learn some lessons moving forward into a larger analysis. And also, given the time of collecting data and doing an analysis, we only did a correlation. We only looked at correlation but didn't go any further than that. So more importantly, is there a relationship between acquisitions, acquiring content, and revenue in a given year? Well, yes, there is. It does show that there is a relatively positive correlation across presses and across subject areas of acquisitions to sales. However, that being said, it varies widely by publisher and by subject area. So where one subject area may show that there's a link between that information, other subject areas don't. They're all over the place. And I'm not sure exactly what is causing that. Some of that might be time to publication, et cetera. But I want to give you a visualization of what that looks at. So the next slide, I don't want you to focus too much on the detail because it can be very overwhelming. But I want you to just look at the differences in all of the data moving forward just to get an idea of what we saw when we looked at the data. So very hard to read, but you can at least see the variances of how each line looks different from the others and how each subject area looks very different from the others. So there are some that seem to be positive. They're tracking along in a very similar manner. And there seem to be some that makes no sense whatsoever. It's just kind of spaghetti. SpaghettiOs all over the place. You just don't know what to make of it. But this is at a publisher level and a subject area level. What we did is we decided to strip out publisher and let's look at subject area, make it a little more concise, a little bit more easy to read. This makes a bit more sense. So when looking at correlation information, if you're seeing numbers that are moving to the negative side of this graph, that means there is a negative relationship or a negative correlation. Basically, in our world today, that means that sales are going up and acquisitions are going down, or vice versa. Sales are going down, acquisitions are going up. They're going in opposite directions. Fortunately, we don't see that here. If anything landed in that middle spot, a 0, that means there's just no relationship. There's no conclusion you can draw. It just is what it is. Fortunately, what we saw across those 5 publishers and these 16 subject areas is that ultimately there is a positive correlation. We have all information that is on the positive side going toward the 1. And as you get closer to the 1, that is the stronger relationship that you're seeing. So in this case, we're seeing linguistics and theology and religion have a stronger relationship between their acquisition of titles and sales, whereas urban studies, Jewish studies, and gender sexuality studies, although still positive, is a weaker relationship between the two. What I find interesting is that they are some of the very specific subject areas we chose, where art, philosophy, history, they're all moving up the chain. So more importantly, it was very important to do this analysis. I think it was a worthwhile endeavor to collect the information and to see what we could gain from what we could grab from publishers. But what we learned is that there is a challenge in getting accurate and consistent information from the publishers, making sure they're actually collecting the data we need to collect in the fields, et cetera, is a bit of a challenge. Everybody's we don't look at data across all publishers in this way. It's a new way of looking at information. It will also become very important for us to collect acquisitions date or contract date, something along those lines, because the contract of publication length is so significantly different between subject areas. So we need to be able to get to that, the detail that we're trying to get to. As you could also see by the graph earlier that Kaiser put up, we had a lot of other responses. And so we need to be very specific when we're moving forward into a larger observation to really think about how granular we need to get in our subject areas and really give a lot of thought to those subject areas that we choose. And finally, there isn't anything that actually tags a book as monograph all the time. Usually you can get to it by subject area, and that's helpful, but to be able to separate out a monograph from other types of publishing can be a challenge. So between the survey results and the data, what did we find? And we found that obviously it's an ecosystem. It is an ever-changing ecosystem. And in order to continue to be sustainable, lists have to be balanced, and it has to be interdisciplinary in order for the sustainability to work. As you saw from some of the things that Mahinder talked about, there is a little bit of mixed decision making between is mission driving acquisitions or is market driving acquisitions? And we're getting kind of answers on both sides, but it seems like mission is winning. It is the editors, it's important for the editors to support the scholarly record and to support the research of the scholars. Moving forward from here, what does this mean? Well, we'd like to do a larger study to cover many more presses to get a better data pool to be able to look at correlations and all that, but also to expand that research into bringing in conversations with editors, discussions with libraries, and with faculty to get a more well-rounded picture of the environment we're sitting in. And coming from Project Muse, where do we fit in? How do we fit into the picture? How do we support our publishing partners and being part of a positive part of this ecosystem? So that leaves the question, does the economic pressure on presses actually inform the shape of the scholarly record? Well, it sounds like yes, but maybe not completely. Acquisition editors maybe need more information and data to make those decisions, but they're also shepherding projects through because they need to support the scholarship. That's still the most important. It'll continue to be important to look at and move forward with new production and distribution methods that may be currently being underutilized at the moment, and to keep following and focusing on and researching the new economic models that are out there or what's new and coming up around the corner. So with that, I'd like to thank you for coming and attending our session, and I think we have about, I don't know, 5 or 10 minutes if there's any questions. 10 minutes if there's any questions, or 11 minutes. Questions or observations that you all have, or if there's anything else my colleagues would like to add.
And I am not nearly as dashing or as charismatic as Anthony, but I will open it up for questions, and we already have our first one.
Bob Holly, retired Wayne State University. Is there any sense in the acquisitions process of looking at the potential for being a good backlist title, or instead of being very trendy, and so all sales will need to come up pretty much during the front list period?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that's, as we were putting together the survey, or when we got the survey results, I think we all began to think of the questions we should have asked as well, having to do with things like course adoption titles. I think, so this is not, we don't have survey data for this. I think most editors think still in terms of print, and I think because they think in terms of print, they're thinking longer than 1 to 2 years. I think editors are thinking 3 to 5 and past that. And the scholarship certainly they're looking for is scholarship that lasts. I mean, I know at our quest, when we have our editorial meetings, that's one of the questions, the assumptions, is that we're publishing a scholarship that's going to last, rather than chasing trends.
Yeah, I suppose a related comment though would be that I do think in the end, when you're doing a projection for sales for a monograph title, you are looking primarily at the first year income. So I think there is a bit of a mix there where if you are being held accountable to the sort of revenue that is going to be brought in by that, then you aren't focusing on the potential of backlist. I think that connects actually to a study that Kaiser was involved in at Cornell University Library around 2010, I think, looking at the sort of life cycle of scholarly monographs, and especially in the humanities and social sciences, you certainly see it's a long life cycle, 12 years?
Yeah, so what we saw, this was looking at use of print books acquired over the past 20 years at Cornell. And the finding that Emily was referring to was looking at a cohort of books acquired at a certain point, and how long there's an active period of discovery of those books. So the first charge of a book in a particular cohort we would see about a 12-year period of books being actively discovered for the first time in the stacks and checked out. After that 12-year period, it began to drop. But there was this sense that something might not be used at all for more than a decade and still get that first use, still be discovered for the first time by scholars or by students. And so I think that was one of the more surprising things that we found, looking at print book usage and finding, as I think other studies have, that a pretty large percentage of the collection, in fact, never circulates, right? But there is this sort of time lag that has to be part of that discussion, and I think it definitely relates to this.
And I think ebooks also throw a whole lot of interesting things into there in terms of discovery layer and so forth. But yeah.
And DDA, I mean, this is something we've.
Thank you.
Hi, Laura Lasham from the University of Chicago Press. I was wondering if the survey contained any questions about profit and loss statements, P&Ls. Like, that might be something interesting to add if it wasn't, because I've worked at a couple different presses, and some of the profit and loss statements I've seen include, for example, projections on subrights revenue and ebook revenue. Some of them don't, shockingly, still, or some have just newly added ebook revenue projections. So I think that would be really interesting. And also, I noted that statement from somebody that said, well, it's impossible to know what subrights income could be applied to which title or which editor. I would encourage maybe opening up the survey to a couple other folks in the press. Some of that data is housed in different silos or areas and could be reached. So just a thought.
Yes, this was not a ringer question, but we did actually ask about how P&Ls are determined for titles. We cut it out for time, but I have the numbers right here. And so we asked, basically, when you're doing a P&L, are you looking for revenue to cover direct costs, to cover direct or indirect costs, to exceed publishing costs, to limit financial loss, or they do not enter a publication decision whatsoever? And of this, let's see, more than 60% of the respondents do not project that their books will do more than cover the cost of publication, whether it's direct costs, which are basically costs you can invoice, or direct plus indirect costs. So that's, so 60%, that's all the editors or the P&Ls are trying to show is that they can recover the direct and indirect costs. And I should say that even direct and indirect costs combined don't actually reflect the cost of producing a book. And then let's see, I think only 10% said that their P&Ls were to limit financial loss. Just over 25% were to exceed the publishing costs, but we didn't find out from how much. And then 2%, I think two respondents said that they actually had minimum target revenues on their P&Ls. So, but yeah, we didn't ask about ancillary revenue like subrights. That is actually something discussed at Cornell. If there's a book that we think has strong translation ability or possibilities, that sort of goes into the decision-making factor. That this is a book that'll translate well, or we could get some translations for it.
Kevin Hawkins, University of North Texas Libraries. The disciplinary breakdown for correlation was really interesting, and I realized that correlation isn't causation, right? You're only showing correlation, but I'm still just trying to make sure I understand kind of what we're saying here. So for fields at the top of that graph, like linguistics, what you're saying is that, or what we could safely say, if I understand correctly, is that in that field, either the editors all have an excellent sense of what's going to sell and get it right, or the audience is like very stable and predictable, right? Or the editors are very mercenary and only know what to take on, right? Some combination of things like this, right? Whereas, say, in gender and sexuality studies, either the editors don't know what they're doing, or the audience is very fickle, right? Or maybe fields like that are being, subsidized intentionally by the press because of institutional, match or something. Am I getting this right?
Yeah, well, and I think you could go even further than that. How long has a press been obtaining content in that field, and how comfortable they are in that field? Was the press going through a change in staff during that period? I mean, we could expand on that for many things. It also might be the subject area itself, and if there are quick changes in the subject area, basing on maybe trends that are happening in the world and things of that sort. So I think there are a lot of things that have come into play, and I'm wondering if we can get at some of those things by surrounding a survey around the data when we send it out, if we do the larger study.
Yeah, I think specifically with gender studies, actually the correlation there is that sales were consistently high, but there weren't a lot of presses publishing in the field.
Right.
So that was one actually where there was a demand apparently in the marketplace for books in gender studies, and yet presses were not jumping in to fill that demand. So that correlation also works that way, not simply that, yeah. So in that case, there's some opportunities there, and
Sales were high, but the number of titles.
the number of titles was low.
low.
Exactly. There was no correlation.
Or it could be high. You just never knew. But
Yeah.
yeah.
We know. No, we knew.
I mean-
we knew that the sales of books in gender studies were high,
in general.
and
right.
yet there were not the number of titles that were being published in gender studies was weirdly low, given the fact that it was such an attractive field in which to publish.
And I would say being acquired,
Being
not
acquired.
published.
Yeah.
So just be cautious that
Yeah.
what the date we were looking at was acquisition.
Yeah.
So is there a difficulty bringing a book to publication in certain subject areas?
So I
Okay.
would like to announce the Cornell University Press Studies Gender Studies series immediately.
Yeah, right. Okay, so the one last piece then is are we correlating with the number of titles from that press or the number of titles in the field as a whole?
In the field as a whole.
Oh, okay.
Across
good.
those five
Across those
presses.
5 presses.
Yes, got it.
Yes.
That's good to know, actually. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Amy Harris from the MIT Press, and I was struck by 2 slides. The first one was the participation in, or I guess it was responses to who's publishing OA monographs by group. And it was very noticeable to me that groups 3 and 4, the largest groups, were saying yes more often than 1 and 2, which are perhaps the presses that are most mission-driven to produce, books in that way. And also by the last slide, sorry to make you flip through all this.
That's okay, I'll find it, keep talking.
Where there was a note about these, that technologies that exist are being underutilized. And I would say that they're underutilized because they suffer from a stigma related to prestige as well as funding. And I was curious because I think a lot these days about how to flip the model, as it were, on prestige and to get more buy-in, especially from researchers, in these new models that support sustainability. And I'm just curious to ask if you have ideas for how we, in this scholarly communications community, can educate people about that, scholars about that.
It's a really good question.
I just want to say one caveat about about these figures and some of the others, especially when we're looking just at the responses from the editorial directors. It is a very small number of responses. So the group 4 presses in this case, it's only 3, right? So it's not whether this would hold up with a bigger study, we don't know for sure, but I think it is striking, right?
I think with any new model, some of it takes time. It takes time for people to be comfortable. It takes time for everybody's thought process to change. So not probably the answer anyone wants to hear, but I think as people do the research, as more OA titles are born OA and get the prestige that they deserve because the research and the scholarship is good, that it will help then flip the model that way. That's just a thought. I'm from an aggregator, not a publisher, but it seems like anytime there's something new in the environment, it just takes time.
And I think too that one of the things that came out of this preliminary data is that that there is sort of in terms of this list balancing that's going on and the ways that different parts of the system rely on each other. I think it causes still some skepticism in terms of the ways that new models will present a long-term solution to sustainability, and that in looking at some of what's available, so for instance, open access funds, a lot of it is at the single title level. So it may be that scholars that are working with a Group 4 press or a Group 4 press itself knows where to go for that funding, or has an institution that backs that funding in some ways. I mean, this is all sort of some amount of guesswork, but also that because you're looking at sort of on one side a list balance and the other the funding for individual titles, there's a question of how much that really sort of broadly and over a long period will sustain the publishing sector itself. I think that sort of went off track, but anyway.
Just from your data, I would also, just as a way of wrapping that topic up, I'm going to make the assumption that when we talk about open access, we're talking about ebooks, right? And from your data, only 1 in 5, or only 1/5 of the total revenue is currently being generated by ebooks. So I think, those two things could potentially go hand in hand. If you want to do open access, you got to do an ebook. And if you're not really comfortable doing an ebook, then you're not going to do open access. There could be a relationship there. I don't know. But, and I don't want to cut you off, Emily, but we're kind of
Out of time. One quick last comment related to that, though, is that I think that's the case for you guys as well, that most publishers that are doing an open access ebook still do sell a print book.
Yep.
So that is really appealing to it's appealing to university presses, for scholarly presses, because there's still the potential there if people want a print book, but the ebook is there, freely accessible. Anyway.
Sure. All right, well, Emily, Kaiser, Mahinder, Nicole, great job. I think there was a ton of information. I know we're going to make this slides available after the meeting, but we thank you for your attention, and everyone enjoy your evening. Thank you to our panel.